Hi, I'm Mike Churchich. I was born in 1948 up in Oregon, and that makes me about 63. Went to the University of Oregon. Now I'm down here in Hayward, California. Well, they moved down to Coos Bay, Oregon, a small little town, and I grew up there. And it was very isolated. I didn't realize just how isolated and even parochial the area was. We were all working class. In 1963, of course, John Kennedy was assassinated. He had brought some spice or some enthusiasm to the presidency. Lyndon Johnson took over, and within the space of about 7 months or 8 months, he got the Civil Rights Act passed, which at the time didn't really excite me either way. Through the decade or so, I realized that it was kind of a seminal event. That's when we started having not necessarily riots, but at least commotions and desire for equal opportunities. In 1969, the demonstrations against the war were continuing and even building to a climax. Something that really affected me, but I didn't know it at the time, I think, was in May of 1970, we had the Kent State killings. Kent State University, there were demonstrations against the war, and National Guard shot into the crowd and killed 4 whites, which brought about an awful lot of controversy and other rioting type things.
On May 4th, 1970, members of the Ohio National Guard fired into a crowd of Kent State University demonstrators, killing 4 and wounding 9 students. The event triggered a nationwide student strike that forced hundreds of colleges and universities to close. It is suggested that the shootings had a direct impact on national politics, and that the event began the slide into Watergate, eventually destroying the Nixon administration. Beyond the direct effects of May 4th, the shootings have certainly come to symbolize the deep political and social divisions that so sharply divided the country during the Vietnam War era.
2 weeks later, same thing happened at Jackson State University in Mississippi. They had 7 killed, and so everything sort of conglomerated together, race riots or racial unrest against the war. In late May, the thing I remember in late May of 1970 was students and faculty going up Pearl Street, which was the main drag of Eugene, National Guardsmen standing in front of them and throwing tear gas at them. It kind of brought home to me that people wanted some change. At that point, I was still working for the audiovisual department, and in fact, for about 2 days, I had an armed escort going around campus with a National Guardsman, because people didn't want me so much; they wanted my equipment to broadcast and things such as that. So that was interesting, if nothing else. The summer of 1968, the Democratic National Convention was being held in Chicago, and there was a lot of controversy. And there was a group called the Chicago 7, which sort of led the demonstrations, or at least they were the ones that were told they were leading the demonstrations. They were the ones that got caught, so to speak. One of them was Abby Hoffman. Another was David Fromm, who was a professor of mine, actually, and I got to know him. So they were free-thinking revolutionaries, if nothing else.
The Chicago 7 were outspoken leaders from several activist organizations that were indicted on charges related to the violence in Chicago. Activists had coordinated protest efforts by over 100 anti-war groups, and when the Chicago Convention began, demonstrators were met with brutal police actions. 589 were arrested, while 219 were injured. The Chicago Seven, while on trial, helped keep the anti-war message in headlines for over half a year. All defendants were sentenced to 5 years and fined $5,000, but convictions were later overturned. While David Fromm was an unknown defendant, John Froines was an educator of chemistry at the University of Oregon, the man Mr. Churches must have known.
Anyway, David Fromm came back to the University of Oregon and was teaching there while I was there. Like I say, I met him and knew him. He gave me some revolutionary ideas. He and a couple of others on the University of Oregon campus, and the two groups, one called the Weathermen, which were a very radical, almost terrorist student group. They wanted to overthrow everything. And the Students for a Democratic Society, which were basically based in Berkeley, actually based in Berkeley, but because of a couple of the Chicago Seven being where I was, we got the cells up there.
The Weathermen, or Weather Underground, was an American radical left organization formed off the student activist group Students for a Democratic Society. Like the Black Panthers, the Weathermen aligned themselves with violent groups and believed there was no example of a peaceful road to fundamental social change. It was considered a terrorist group after threats of bombings of government buildings, banks, and police departments went out. The organization always sent warnings before their explosions to prevent injuries. However, one explosion in San Francisco resulted in death, and another misfire killed several Weathermen, sending the organization into hiding. The group disbanded in the mid-1970s.
There were the splinter groups, some splinter groups from the Black Panthers at this point. So it all kind of came together in this, what was a relatively small area of 250,000 people or so. And I think that's why we had such a violent reaction to the war. There was always somebody there to stir up the action. My father's parents came over from Croatia, which became part of Yugoslavia after the First World War, and then after Tito died, it became Croatia again.
Josip Tito was a Yugoslav revolutionary and a president of the Yugoslav Federation from 1953 to 1980. His internal policies maintained peaceful coexistence of the nations of the Yugoslav Federation. His internal policies included the suppression of nationalist sentiment and the promotion of the brotherhood and unity of the 6 Yugoslav nations. However, his death in 1980 caused the Yugoslav republics to emerge, causing civil wars that lasted the decade and caused unrest to this day.
This was right around 1910, and I moved to a small, isolated town in central Washington, and we're mining coal. Everybody spoke Croatian, except they had to learn English in the public schools. My grandmother never did speak English. Neither did my grandfather. My mother's family came from a relatively small town outside of Seattle, Washington, in a place called Renton. And my parents, and we were very, very parochial. We would almost, or my parents would almost vote the straight ticket for Democrats. Everybody around me, almost everybody I should say, had 2 parents and 1 or 2 kids in each family. We were so normal that it hurt. I didn't know that there was any other kind of upbringing until I started seeing other people. Actually, a lot of that is when I moved down here and I started seeing single parent families and families without marriage, things such as that. I think our entire family, except for one person, was solidly Democrat. And, high school was a little bit enlightening, I guess, because I started to meet people from outside the really close area I was in. But after high school, when I turned 18, the minimum age, I went to work in the lumber mills around there. That was the place to get the best money. Working in the lumber mills gave me more incentive to go on and get an education. The work was rough, I didn't mind that, I was 18 or so. The people just were not stimulating. They just weren't terribly exciting. And I wanted to go out and do something else. I went to community college down in Oregon, Coos Bay, for 2 years. Then in 1966, I went up to Eugene, where the University of Oregon is, and that's when, for want of a better term, my education kind of started. I suddenly met people from other countries, met people of other colors, other persuasions. It wasn't until I got up to University of Oregon and then went on to other places that I started realizing that things were not necessarily black and white, but more shades of gray. The conservatives, the Republicans, and some others had a point of view also. They weren't just sticks in the mud. Bobby Kennedy, who was running for president, came to our campus and actually got to meet him. It was exciting. It was, I don't know if I would have voted for him or not. Yeah, he was awfully young and inexperienced, but he was exciting. He brought a lot of enthusiasm. And of course, the next month he was assassinated down in Los Angeles.
Robert Kennedy was an American politician and a noted civil rights activist. After his brother John's assassination, Kennedy began a campaign for the presidency in 1968 and was a front-running candidate of the Democratic Party. After defeating Eugene McCarthy, Kennedy delivered a victory speech at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, where he was shot by Ciaran Ciaran.
A little hard sometimes to, especially for me, talking about the 60s without thinking about specific instances. It was the era of when marijuana got really big among students, and of course we had LSD, window pane acid, and all sorts of other things. I've never really been much of a rebel. A lot of it's gone on around me and I've watched it, but I'd participate on the wings or on call it the wings, perimeter sometimes, but it was just interesting to see what other people were doing or what other people were thinking. And how that affected my thinking.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Churches.
You're welcome.
I really appreciate it. It was a pleasure.